So welcome back, guys. Long time no see. I've It was a mix of me being busy and I wasn't really in the mood to record some videos, really. But today I found an interesting article that I found in my bookmarks. So I've been thinking of making the next few videos uh, about stuff I have in my bookmarks, interesting stuff I have in my bookmarks, and this is one of them. And it's about climate change. This article was written in 2019, so it's been a bit more than a year since it was uploaded, and it's from a site called Clean Technica, and they focus on renewable energy, green energy, or clean energy, or whatever you want to call it. And that's their main focus. And they cover news regarding our fight against climate change. And in this regard, there was one country that is doing a lot, and that is China. And the article is titled "China is doing a lot better on climate change than most people realize." Now, this country gets criticized a lot by people, mostly very ignorant people who say, "Look, China is the biggest emitter in the world right now," which is true, and they are clearly not doing enough, which is obviously false. And we need to keep in mind that China is still a developing country, and although it is one of the few outliers in the developing world, it still is affected by the same issues. So, to a far lesser degree, of course. But so, as author points out here, while a lot of fingers are being pointed at China by people committed to both inaction and action in North America, the actual climate story in China is much different than most people realize. So when we look at and I like charts and stuff, and we'll see a graph soon in this article, which shows China's increasing emissions. What it doesn't show typically in pretty much every graph or chart or whatever you see, what it doesn't show is the slowing down of the growth in emissions coming from China. And there's most articles are not really that in depth into it, looking into it, and most people who make these graphs, it's not really something that they take into account for whatever reason. And I don't really have the statistics on me, but I'm pretty certain the growth in emissions is slowing down. And one day we'll see from China, most likely. One day we will see a point where emissions growth becomes stagnant, or it even starts declining. So let's get on with the article. So a friend and an on and off collaborator on IPOs and technical innovation initiatives just returned from a month in Beijing, where he was applying machine learning against video to speed training in sports. So let's move on, get to the. So these are basic observations that anyone who has been to the country can make. The air was clean and the sky was blue. And as pointed out here, the improvement in air quality in Chinese cities has been extraordinary over the past decade. So it wasn't really that long ago. So it was like 5 years ago. You could still see very gray skies in cities like Beijing and even and Shanghai. I shouldn't say even because it's such a huge city, but and even in the cleanest cities, you'd see smog quite often, and that was just 5 years ago. The second was that the streets were incredibly quiet. Now, this is an observation that, of course, I wouldn't know sitting here in Australia, but which I found actually surprising. We don't really have that many electric cars here in Australia, so we're not very used to what should I say? We're used to even with a small amount of cars hearing a lot of noise. So that's why this was surprising for me. Was that the streets were incredibly quiet, much quieter than the streets of Vancouver outside the coffee shop we were in, as he told me about the strip. And it wasn't that the streets were empty, quite the opposite. They were packed with cars and people, but virtually all the cars were electric. No engine noise, no diesel trucks rumbling past, no motorcycles revving, just tire noise, with which at the lower speeds typical to city streets is very quiet. So clean air and quiet streets in the capital of China, a city of almost 22 million people, and that's true of most other major Chinese cities as well. A lot of people's perspectives on China are stuck in the past on this subject, as on many others. Very, very, very true. Especially in regards to economics, which is what I specialize in. But moving on. Right now, the US is embroiled in a trade war with China. So, this being a 2019 article, we can move on past that. One of the key arguments many climate change deniers return to over and over again when all of the other arguments are rapidly debunked is that it doesn't matter what the US does because China is the largest emitter of CO2 in the world and is still opening up coal plants. Now, regarding that issue, the one with coal plants, that's a really complex situation there. I don't want to get into that in this video because it would just stretch it out too much. But what I want to point out is, yes, China is the largest emitter of CO2 in the world, but what these folks don't know or don't want to know or don't want to acknowledge is that in terms of cumulative emissions, so the amount of emissions since the Industrial Revolution to now, China, I believe, right now would be second or third, and the US is by far the first. So I think the UK is still above China. But I could be wrong. But the US is still by far the first. So when looking at that, what we get, the logical conclusion is that the US is the most responsible for climate change and should be the one doing the most about it. and the UK second, and China third, and so on and so forth. But anyway, moving on. That's just not a Republican or climate change denier talking point. Joe Biden's climate change action plan spends most of his foreign policy section pointing fingers, from its Belt and Road Initiative to its coal subsidies. So once again, the coal thing, it's really complex. But I can explain it in some other video I may make in the future about it. And regarding Biden's climate change action plan, we know it's not going to get far. And in Canada, we have an election coming up in October for Americans. Here's my, okay. And the big action plan from the conservative leader on climate is exporting natural gas to China to displace coal generation there, but not much action in Canada, of course, because conservatives, when it comes to actually improving the country, that's a big no-no there. Yes, that's as dumb as a box of hammers, but it's consistent with North American perspectives on China. It's not quite as bad as how Australian government saying they're shipping coal to India was a climate plus, but it's close. Yeah, that was very stupid. I didn't even pay attention. I didn't even know that happened actually. Uh, Shamefully so. But that does sound very stupid for obvious reasons. But there's another story on China, one consistent with my friend's observations, and one that's not being told in its entirety or understood in the West. China is likely on track to achieve its relatively light emissions targets a decade early. Now, you guys may not agree with me, and that's fine, but I do agree with the author on China's targets on when it comes to emissions being pretty light. And I know you're gonna throw the developing country not as much resources, blah blah blah. But I want to say we all know how much they achieve in 1 year, more than any other country in history, and they have the means and capacity to achieve this kind of goal, which is why I think it's a light emissions target. But I'll get to that in a moment, actually. And it's been bending the curve on emissions faster than any country in history, just as it ramped them up faster than any country in history. So, with rapid growth comes a rapid increase in emissions. We all know that. But what most people don't realize is that as our technology advances, the our emissions actually decrease per person. So that's a big opportunity if we go in that direction. If all countries go in that direction, big growth opportunity, and it cleans up our planet as well. And let's go back. Okay. And we know that China produces about twice as much CO2 annually as the US. Keep in mind the Chinese population is 4 times as large as the US, but they're already working on limiting their already high emissions down, even though per person they're not as responsible as the United States. Moving on, but about half as much per person year. The US is responsible for twice as much CO2 historically in total as China, with only a quarter of China's population. Well, China has been catching up and is the leading country by emissions. Let's ensure that we understand that it's 18% of the world's population and the second biggest economy in the world. First biggest, depending on what measure you use. 15% of the world's GDP is from China right now, or 20%, depending on what measure you use. Now that we understand the per capita and GDP aspects, and that China isn't the primary nation responsible for global warming, just the one emitting the most CO2 today. That's the keyword today. Let's look at what they're doing about it. So it's what I said before. They aren't actually the one responsible. It's the US, and the US is clearly not doing enough. And in typical US fashion, they're pointing fingers rather than doing anything about it. So going back to the east, they are turning on more low-carbon electric generation annually in the form of hydro, wind, solar, and nuclear than any other country globally. And you may not know about me, but I really prefer the nuclear option because of its scale and how clean it is, even compared to other renewable energy. I know the dangers. It's a bit riskier to use. I know all that, but I think the positives far outweigh the negatives. And for each of these categories, typically more than the next 2 to 3 countries. While its nuclear program has been less effective than its wind and solar programs, every terawatt per hour of nuclear generation displaces a terawatt per hour of coal and gas generation and should be welcomed. As Biden's climate plan points out, China invested $3 in renewable energy for every $1 the US invested in 2017. in an ideal world, we'd all be working together to advance nuclear technology so that we can completely phase out coal and gas generation. But we don't live in that ideal world. So in 2012, China commissioned the Three Gorges Dam. I think that's how it's pronounced. The largest capacity hydroelectric dam in the world, capable of generating about 100 terawatts per hour of low carbon electricity every year. So it's a pretty impressive amount, and it is building more high voltage direct current transmission than any other country in the world to get that renewable electricity to major population centers with low losses. So that's one of the innovations in the energy sector, which I wish the whole planet would adopt, but we can't be expecting too much. And so we have a chart of all the stuff, and it goes out to 2030. So you got nuclear generation projected. I think it's going to be higher for nuclear. It seems kind of stagnant, but I think it's going to be higher. Solar, combined wind and solar, yeah. So that's for the projection out to 2030. China has over 400,000 electric buses on its roads, which are already displacing 270,000 barrels of oil demand a day. So not only does it help with emissions, but also helps with the imports of some key resources like oil, and that helps with China's what's it called, surplus balance in its account. And naturally, that means that all electric bus manufacturers with any global market share that registers are Chinese here. So we all know all this stuff. Most countries with big electric bus fleets have well under 273 orders of the magnitude fewer. Chinese citizens also buy 50% of all electric cars sold in the world, and there are more car companies devoted to that electrification than any other place in the world, pretty much. And we know about the 30,000 electrically powered, 30,000 kilometers of electrically powered high-speed rail. Pretty much my favorite public transport system by far. And they're going to do extend it to 38,000 kilometers. And that is far beyond what any other country in the world has right now. And Europe only has a third of China's high-speed rails, and the US and Canada, we all know they have zero. Same with Australia. And the rest are in East Asia, so Japan and South Korea, outside of Europe, of course. And naturally, China is building most of the world's electric bicycles. I'm not that well familiar with that, but I'm not really surprised either. Other small electric vehicles such as skateboards and scooters. China's transportation electrification strategies surpass every country in the world, including so-called the electric car leader Norway. So I'm guessing Norway's sorry. So I'm guessing Norway's in percentage terms, maybe. I haven't really checked up on Norway in that regard. So they also have the most aggressive reforestation program in the world. So we have all heard of that lately. You know, it's been a quite famous article. Just a second. And they cover the size of France in terms of area. That's how much trees they've planted. 38 billion trees since 1990. So that's a very impressive number. So you may have heard like trees aren't that helpful in regards to sucking in carbon, and that's true. But they're very helpful when it comes to biodiversity. So yeah, it's like it's they do suck in carbon, but that's like a secondary thing when it comes to them. As the recent trillion trees study pointed out, planting trees is one of the simplest and best mechanisms to draw down atmospheric CO2. Project Drawdown puts afforestation at 15 on list of the top 100 methods of tackling global warming, ranked by cost versus benefit. So, in my Reddit post, I have talked about Project Drawdown, and I'm fairly certain the Chinese government, at least at the top levels, they're aware of these methods. But they basically measure the cost and benefit in monetary terms. So most of the time, it costs more than the profit you get from it. But it's obviously we're not looking for profit in that regard. And this is a graph showing forest area. So very impressive. So this is even with rapid urbanization. So with cities taking up a larger area. So keep that into account. They own the global solar panel market. 8 of the largest manufacturers in the world are Chinese. Goldwind is a wind turbine manufacturer, Chinese as well, and it's the second largest by market share in the world. And recently taking over its second spot from GE. I'm assuming that that's General Electric, but still trailing Denmark's Vestas. And of course, China, unlike the US, is signatory to the Paris Accord and is on track to vastly exceed its 2030 pledge. So seen I've seen some of the Paris Accord targets, and they aren't very impressive to say the least. So China vastly exceeding its 2030 pledge is pretty much expected. And in 2020, they did exceed that pledge. Of course, we heard of that. Those pledges are inadequate to curb global warming, so I agree with the author on that. It's clearly not enough, but China is doing their part. And they are likely to increase their targets radically, just as it is expected to double its solar and potentially wind generation targets for 2030. So those are all really exciting developments. I'm really glad that they're really pushing themselves when it comes to this. I do wish the rest of the world would emulate them, but I know that's wishful thinking. Yeah, and it's very worth pointing out that while China's emissions rose 2.3% in 2018, the US emissions rose by 3.4%. And this is with China having vastly more increased urbanization than the US at that point. So they, in terms of growth, they're growing far faster than the US in urbanization and everything like that. So what we're seeing is that China is becoming more efficient every single year, to the point where even while it's rapidly outgrowing the U.S. economically, its are emissions growth are slowing down. So we could see a point where the emissions growth start to stagnate, and that'll be an interesting development. And China has done more to address fossil fuel subsidies than the US has as well. In other words, as US politicians point fingers at China, the US is actually going the wrong direction faster and doing less to bend the curve in the right direction. While a lot of fingers are being pointed at China by people committed to both inaction and action in North America, the actual climate story is much different than most people realize. Yeah, and I agree, it should be looked to for inspiration and encouraged in that effort. Not attacked, or and definitely not used as an excuse for inaction. And I think that's it. And that's Michael Barnard. Smart guy. He knows what he's talking about. I pretty much agree with everything he said in this article. And that's pretty rare. But usually when I read these articles, I feel like they simplify a lot of things. But this guy correctly pointed out the often missed growth in emissions and the decrease and increase in that growth. And most people only just look at the percentage increase, or not increase, but they just look at the percentage, how much a country's emitting and stuff like that. As like where was it? In this article here, they just look at in this graph here, they just look at a graph like this, and then they assume they see emissions increasing. But what they don't realize is that the emissions growth is slowly decreasing over that period of time, whereas in the United States it's actually increasing as of late. So China is becoming more efficient, even though uh, its manufacturing and urbanization and everything like that is continuing to increase. So we know that just from looking at the data in that context alone, that they're really doing the most out of any country by far. One other thing we need to keep in mind is that pretty much the rest of these countries, so the US, the EU, the United Kingdom, these are all I don't know what I think post-industrial would be the correct term. And India is clearly not even an industrialized country. So these three have achieved industrialization before, and that's the huge amount of really rapid increase you see in emissions there, which is steeper than China's actually, especially the United Kingdom here. And I believe the EU's is more gradual, but that's where industrialization first occurred, and these were the first countries to become developed. But as they became developed, so around the 1950s, or past that, I would say 1980s, to be honest, the UK and the US, they both lost their industries. They became post-industrial societies, so that's a decrease you see in emissions from them. And same with the EU, with the exception of Germany and Austria and Switzerland, I would say. They became deindustrialized over time. That's why those Germanic states didn't. That's a separate topic. I might cover that one day, but it's not actually my area of expertise because it's to do with banking, and that's a different branch of economics which I don't specialize in. I specialize in high growth economics, but one day we'll probably cover that. And yeah, anyway, so I expect if this graph went out to 2030 or something, I expect China's emissions to continue to increase. But if you can imagine the line there, slowly by slowly, it's starting to stagnate. And I believe 2030 is where the government projects China's emissions to what's it called, hit their peak before falling. So their predictions are in line with my predictions as well. So yeah, so that was a look at the country doing the most to fight climate change. And with that, I'll see you guys next time.